because I focused in the last video on property dualism, it makes sense that one of my favorite theories of consciousness would be consciousness as a non-physical property. I find the zombie experiment to be fascinating, and I think it really gets at the core of consciousness and the difficulty that we have in explaining it. Cunningham calls it the explanatory gap. We don't even know what consciousness is. It's hard to explain. But for me and for Chalmers, it cannot just be a physical thing. And building off of some form of property dualism, I believe that consciousness can be explained as a non-physical property. Now, I like this view because it seems to me to maintain one of the essential aspects of consciousness, meaning it cannot be reduced to being completely physical. And also, I think this view has some really fascinating implications for animal consciousness and other things. It doesn't seem to necessarily be chauvinistic, but that actually might be its downfall. In fact, it might be not chauvinistic enough because, well, in that view, it's possible for panpsychism that everything has consciousness: candle consciousness, pen consciousness, phone consciousness. That's gourd consciousness. That's a problem. That's a problem. And so there's one response that maybe for me helps a little bit. I think if you look at a view of God, like the pantheistic view of God, for me that reconciles a little bit of it, because in that view we believe that we are in God and that God is not reducible to us. So you could construe that non-physical property as God, or God's consciousness, or something like that, that still maintains some of the problems of differentiation of consciousness, which to me is kind of a big problem. So you take panpsychism, you add it onto the problem of differentiation of consciousnesses, conscientiae, whatever, and that really does become a problem. So while this view does maintain a kind of more than physical description of consciousness, which for me is important, it really opens things up and becomes really complicated. In fact, the explanation of consciousness as being everywhere actually for me seemed to be not much of a description at all, which is why I'm moving to my next view, which is the one that I would land at, which is Mysterianism. Now, Mysterianism says we don't have the cognitive framework for understanding consciousness. Meaning, like when we say that consciousness is everywhere, that doesn't make any sense. It's a misapplication of terms because you can't explain consciousness in a temporal fashion. And for me, this really is intriguing. First of all, it acknowledges the reality of consciousness. It acknowledges the complexity of consciousness. And then it also acknowledges that our inabilities epistemologically to understand and comprehend those kinds of things. If consciousness is a non-physical property, then it makes sense then that it wouldn't be able to fit into any kind of temporal language. And for me, that makes sense. It also, I think, kind of correlates to and walks alongside views of God that are really intriguing, especially pantheism and those kinds of things. So while it may, to some, be a kind of defensive position that says, we really can't know, I find Mysterianism to maintain a lot of the major premises of consciousness that I hold, while also not sacrificing on any of the major ideas as the consciousness as a non-physical property tends to do.